encourage people to use the cloud, but I'm not going to require it because there are people with no credit cards. All right, anyway, make it some online people. That's what I thought. All right. And yep, good. All right, so we've got a few news items to look at here in a few minutes. So let me see if I can move this thing off the screen and shrink this thing down. All right. So here's a few news articles I thought were interesting. So this is a side channel attack where they can steal passwords, but in fact, it's not as exciting as you might think. You have to have a separate network connection that goes into a chip on the same motherboard as the machine you're attacking. And it sends a stream of packets, and it's able to tell from the exact time it takes to process the packet when you press the key. So what you get is the time when the key was pressed. And if from the pattern of someone's typing, the time gives you some information about what key they pressed. So it's very far from a practical attack to actually steal somebody's password.
With frequency analysis?
Yeah, well, the idea is you record real data of that person typing until you learn their characteristic key delay pattern. Yeah, what's that?
Literally idiosyncrasies and signature.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah. So I mean, it sounds extremely unlikely to be a real threat. Anyway, well, here's blockchain, which is almost always snake oil. This sounds like snake oil, although it isn't. You guys usually don't have quite enough details to be sure. They have a smartphone that uses blockchain to encrypt your calls, and I have no idea why you would use a blockchain for this, but it's going to do something like negotiate the key over the blockchain. But the last thing you'd want is to have a permanent public record of all the keys. So like most blockchain projects, it seems very senseless at first glance, but we'll see if anybody buys it and anybody tests it. A lot of people try to get money by just throwing blockchain in their project the way they used to just throw internet in their product in the hopes that it will hypnotize people and they will give you money. So the Russians are upgrading their troll factories. In 2016, they had the Internet Research Agency was a government-sponsored bunch of trolls that would make multiple fake accounts pretending to be various political groups in America and posting tweets, which they would make up. And now they have greatly upgraded their techniques. There's some elections in Moscow. And in Moscow, the elections are all rigged. They take any candidate that has a real chance of winning and jail them or kill them. And then they run complete losers against their preferred candidate so they'll always win. But what they did was a group of people decided to fight back, and they decided to choose candidates that were not very popular, but that they thought would vote their way and have an underground movement to support these other guys so they could get somebody in there that was favorable. And this became popular and everyone joined in. And then it turned out that the whole thing was fake, run by the government, to make people feel like they were protesting when they were in fact voting the way the government wanted them to vote.
Really?
So that's pretty clever. And it's also, you can see very close to whether they come in America and pretend to be like a patriotic Donald Trump supporting gang or an angry liberal gang like Bernie supporters, and then pretend to be all these people and get you all involved in marching with them to like stir up trouble. And so anyway, this is their latest attempt. And I think it was the Grug that posted this on Twitter. He said, you know, we're not even making the slightest attempt to get ready to defend ourselves against the attacks they used in 2016. But they're already upping their game, of course, because it worked fine for them and they're all set to do it again.
So that was all a fake election, right?
What's a fake election?
The last one in Russian elections?
Oh, well, they've always been fake in Russia. I mean, they have elections, but they always rig them by removing candidates. And by also, that's this one, and this one here. Yeah, okay. That was this one here being manipulated, yeah.
Wow. Is it not overblown like the old Russian everything?
Oh, I don't think so. In fact, I've seen videos of the election offices and the people running in polls are just stuffing them with fake ballots and stuff.
Oh, I mean here. Like
here. Oh, here. Oh, I think their influence here was not that large. People showed they definitely made thousands of media accounts. They definitely made a bunch of ads and everything, but it's not clear that swayed anybody. In fact, and here's somebody saying, at least Russia has fake election. China does not even have that. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yes, China doesn't even pretend to have elections. But actually, this reminds me, the other thing I wanted to show you. Yeah, this one. See, there's a huge poll out today, which Donald Trump is mad about, saying Donald Trump's thing has fallen. And every week for the last 2 years, the Washington Post and the New York Times say, Trump's popularity has fallen. It's fallen again. It's fallen again. And it's fake news. It's always fake news. It hasn't moved an inch 40% of people approve of Trump right from the start, and they still approve of Trump. There's been nothing but noise.
Jesus.
It's been totally fake. And if you read the mainstream press, you would think it's been falling, and it's complete lies. It hasn't moved a bit. And this is why I think that the influence on the election was not that large, because a lot of people really support Trump. If it was really like 60-40 then they wouldn't have been able to overcome that difference. It was more like 51-49, and they might have been able to sway it a little bit. But they can't put somebody in there without a lot of people really supporting them. And so that's why I think Trump's going to win again, because I think nothing has changed at all. He has 40% of people that love him, and they will vote. The Democrats have 60% that hate him, but only half of them are going to show up. Because
that's been pretty solid numbers.
I know, and they aren't moving it a bit. And nobody's changing their mind. The same people that love Trump, everything that happens, they say, see, that's right, that's why I love him. And the other people, see, that proves he's no good. And nobody moves an inch.
It has dipped, right, from like
Oh, well,
2017.
yeah, it maybe dipped a little in the first month or something. Getting elected changed things, but after that, it's never moved again. And if you read the mainstream press, every week is another, Trump's thing falls, it falls, it falls, it falls. They never say it rises. But obviously, it's rising just as much as it falls. Yeah, well, they know that what will sell the paper is saying it fell and everybody will buy it. Oh boy, Trump's finally getting it. And even Trump is reacting to the headlines, despite the fact that there's no actual substance. Because that's all he reads too, anyway.
He fired Bolton today, right?
He did fire Bolton, yep, for leaking stuff.
Well, Bolton says he quit.
Well, of course, yeah, usually it has to resign. So anyway, that's the Russians at it. So Proton Mail has a bunch of new security features that are pretty interesting, but I think, well, wait a minute for him to come back. See how many we got online. Yeah, all right. Anyway, Proton Mail had a lot of these things. Web key directory, a way to look up public keys. That's a new one to me. Dane I know about. Dane is like HTTPS using DNS, and a way to, and these are both intending to make sure that mail is encrypted. The problem with encrypted email, is it's only encrypted from server to server, and you don't really know if it was encrypted at every hop when it gets to you. And there are these new technologies intending to try to enforce that. And expect CT and public key pins report only. These are ways to deal with revoked keys and compromised keys, certificate transparency, and so on. So that, and here's another one to check on the certificate authorities. So they're adding a whole lot of new features to Proton Mail. Which is, of course, more concerned with this than other people. But there are a bunch of add-ons to try to deal with the various attacks against these encryption routines. And it would be good to get used to them and begin learning how they work. And no thanks for whatever this garbage is. Oh yeah, this one's fun. I see another chat message coming in. Isn't Proton Mail talking with Huawei? Oh, I do not know about that. That's interesting. That may be that Proton Mail is going to partner with Huawei. It's the first I've heard of it. If you find a link, email it to me or put it in the comments here. I'd be interested to know. Anyway, this one I thought is interesting. You have a Lamborghini. It's going to be electric, and they've made it have a lot of power. It goes from like 0 to 70 in 2 seconds, which is really fast. And it does it by, they have capacitors, which charge really fast and discharge really fast, but they don't hold much total charge. So they don't power it 100% electrically, but they have capacitors to give it a big boost. So you can have a huge burst of acceleration.
They don't hold that charge, but they release it?
Yeah, well, you can charge them up. It's like a flash bulb. You can charge it up and then poof, you get a burst of power, and then it takes a while to charge up again. They don't actually hold enough to be the whole gas tank, but they have enough to give you a big boost.
It's got a big spike.
Yeah.
Energy.
Yeah, and so I guess when you step on the gas, it must really move. Let's see, and here, a link. Okay, look, talking with Huawei, just talking. Okay, great. Capacitors are not batteries. That's right. Capacitors are the alternative to batteries.
They work.
Yeah, but they charge faster and discharge faster. Anyway, Proton Mail and Huawei. Okay, they'll be bringing Proton Mail. Okay, well, I'm going to save this link in the news links, so I can find it later if I can get my bar to show up. If there's any part of this thing that will actually let me do it. Okay. All right. Yeah, and there's more chat coming in. Okay. The alternatives, batteries keep their voltages when depleted.
That's not true at all.
Well, they have a different profile. They keep their voltage for a while until they fall all the way to 0. They don't decline the same way capacitors.
Depends on what kind of batteries, but
Yeah.
that's totally false. Batteries keep it.
Yeah, but capacitors are different electrically than batteries, you're right. Anyway, all right. So I think we ought to just carry on here. Let me point out the new projects. So what I did was, I found that once again, VMware is not working very well on Windows machines. And it reminded me, this is the last class of mine that actually uses these worthless local virtualization products like VMware and VirtualBox. And I see no point in making anybody use this garbage at all. As far as I can tell, it's useless and not worth wasting your time on. So I'm putting this stuff in the cloud. Now, in order to do this, the problem is the textbooks malware samples are written for XP. And many of them will not run on Windows 7, so I've been rewriting them, learned how to rewrite the malware, and that's moving along. But I got the first few projects up here, and the next several more on the way. So you should make a cloud machine, and I've got one here. You'll end up with a Google Cloud Windows server, and you should be able to do all your projects on these machines. So let's see if this nonsense. Oh, they're probably blocking RDP at the college because they block everything. So it's a Viper. And by the way, blocking RDP is not a bad thing to do, although blocking outgoing RDP is silly, but blocking incoming RDP is a very good idea because there are so many RDP vulnerabilities like Bluekeep. That, and if some, Bluekeep is the latest one. There's been a whole bunch of devastating RDP vulnerabilities, so you certainly don't want anybody using RDP and exposing it to the internet. Anyway, so you get a cloud server like this, and you can do your malware analysis inside there, and that's the plan. So you can install things on here, and I'll demonstrate stuff on here later. But that's what I highly recommend. I think that will be far better for you than managing to get VMware Workstation or Player or VirtualBox running on one machine, because you will rapidly discover that it doesn't run on the next machine, and you have to go through ridiculous amounts of debugging, and that skill is not worth much on the job. So using cloud machines, however, is worth a lot on the job. So anyway, let's talk about debugging. This is the topic for today. I moved the chapters out of order. I should mention that also. I did this the last time I taught this class because the students all got real upset about IDA. IDA scares people. It's the closest to math you get in the course, and so I decided it would be better to do debugging first. That's why it goes to chapter 8. From chapter 4 to chapter 8, debugging is friendly. IDA is the hardest part, so you should have some practice looking at assembly code before you hit IDA. So this is my latest attempt to improve things, but it is sort of screwy. The chapters are now out of order. I moved chapters 8 and 9 before 5, 6, and 7 in an attempt to make it easier, and we'll see how it goes. So we're up to debugging, and so here's the game. A disassembler takes apart the program and lets you see the code before it runs. But debuggers show you the operation of the process while it is running. So you see the memory, the registers, the arguments, the functions, and you can change them and pause at any point during running. So it's actually much easier. It's dynamic analysis instead of static analysis. There are two common debuggers. There's Ollie Debug and the later version called Immunity Debugger, which is based on the same code base. They're essentially identical, except Ollie's the older one and Immunity is the newer one. And then there's WinDebug, which is the one Microsoft uses, and it is much more user hostile and frustrating to use, but you can debug the kernel with it. So we will use it a bit when we get to kernel debugging, but Ollie Debug is a famous thing used by script kiddies to cheat on Windows games. It's very fun and very friendly, and that's where I thought it's the right place to start, where it's the easiest way to get involved in a little bit of assembly. It's not pronounced windbag. Oh, I have no idea. I think some people do call it windbag. I don't know if I've ever heard anybody talk about it, so I don't know what you call it. Anyway, so their source level debuggers are what developers use, where you tie it right to your original source in C or C++, and then you can refer to those line numbers, and that's something you can do if you're writing the code. But typically in malware analysis, you don't have access to the source code, of course. All you have is the compiled code, so you have to do assembly level debuggers, where all you have is the binary machine code, and it's going to disassemble it to turn it into assembler, and you're going to have to read that. That's what you mostly have to do. When Windows crashes, Windows will offer to open it in the debugger. Debug the program is one of the options. Back in the old days, it used to open it in something like Dr. Watson, but you can specify the debugger, and usually if you have WinDebug installed, it will open it in WinDebug. So that is an option when things crash. Although we're not going to do it that way in this course, you can do it that way. All right, and so here's the two modes of debugging, of course, just like there's two modes to run programs. In user mode, these are things you run after logging in, so it's tied to your user account. These are things you start from the start button or by clicking on the desktop or in a command prompt. And so it's running in user land and does not have direct access to the hardware. And your debugger also runs in user land, and you're running your debugger like you might run Microsoft Word or any other application. And that's fine, but you're only debugging user mode code. You're not debugging the kernel because you don't have access to the kernel. Kernel mode debugging used to be really, really annoying. Now, in order to write the kernel of the operating system, they have to debug it to get the bugs out of it. And so this means you will have to have it crash and then examine the state of memory where it crashes, or run it to a certain point and then stop it at a breakpoint to see what's going on. But if you were to stop the kernel, the whole machine would freeze. So the way you used to do it was with two machines connected with a serial cable. And that means the old, I think, 25-pin serial cable that doesn't even exist on modern machines. You'd connect them with a serial cable, boot the machine in debug mode, and now this would be a slave machine, and you'd have a master machine controlling it. And therefore, you could pause the kernel on the slave machine, and the master machine would control it through the serial cable. That was the original plan. This was really annoying, almost impossible with any modern hardware, and very clumsy. And so you reboot your thing, you go to debugging mode down here. Boot your machine in this special debugging mode, and then it will expect a connection with a serial cable and make itself a slave for someone else to control it. All right, so one thing about this is the print screen key is interpreted as sysrec and caused the blue screen of death. So this was great suffering in the lab in previous semesters, because I teach this class and students would turn on debugging mode, and then the other students trying to do other projects would hit the print screen key to get a screenshot, and the machine would give them the blue screen of death. That was good, clean fun. Anyway, so the new way to do this is Mark Rusinovich. Mark Rusinovich is the fantastic guy that made sysinternals. He made many, many tools that make it much, much easier to see what's going on inside Windows than it ever was before. And he solved this by giving us live KD. Now, remember, back before I said if a program crashes, it will offer to debug it. Now, it will also offer to give you a crash dump if a program crashes, where it just takes a copy of the memory at the point of the crash and puts it in a file so you can analyze it later. And if you pay Microsoft for support contract, you can email them that crash dump, and they will analyze it and tell you what the problem is. And that's what most of the Microsoft knowledge base is the results of those analyses. But what Mark Rusinovich wrote here in Live KD, it does a memory dump and then lets you see it in WinDebug. So you can see the state of the kernel with only a single machine. Now, you cannot put a breakpoint in the kernel and stop it, but you can still examine the kernel, and it turns out to be pretty good. So this is very nice. It just creates a crash, and you can now examine the code that's running in the kernel and the things and the memory contents in the kernel. Yeah?
So you would pay Microsoft to analyze it should be the other way around.
Well, Microsoft has, you can just buy Windows and use it as it is, and then you get normal updates, or you can pay for a support contract. And then you can make a certain number of calls to support, and then you can send up these things and they'll analyze it for you. It's something a lot of companies did. I don't know if they still do. They used to pay, back in times of XP, it was fairly common, and I think it still is, that you pay for extended support from Microsoft, and now they will help you debug anything that goes wrong. Anyway, so there's a nice online thing here from Joe McRae, who one of my favorite teachers. I taught this class and my exploit development class largely because Joe McRae showed me it was possible. He's got a nice thing, exploit development for mere mortals. He's basically the East Coast version of what I'm doing here. He's teaching exploit development. He teaches stuff to the NSA people and all sorts of things. And he's at a similar level and does similar things and tries to make these elite, complicated things easier so that less elite people can learn them. And there's a video if you want to watch that. This is one of the things that inspired me to write the 127, is just this video of him showing how you can do a little bit of this exploit development, and it's not really too mind-boggling and complicated. If you try reading the books, like the Shellcoder's Handbook, it looks too hard. But it's not that hard if you have somebody getting you to start using a friendly debugger like Ollie right away. Anyway, so that's what I'm hoping to do here. So I got some Cahoots. This is chapter 8A. And there they are. And it looks good. All right, I got to make. What's that? Yeah. Yeah, we're doing the chapters out of order. in the hopes of making it easier. This is CNIT 126. 910. All right. All right. All right. That might be about it. I'll wait a couple more seconds, but I think we got about as many as we can get. Ah, maybe not. It's almost Greek, but not quite. Anyway. All right. All right, so which technique requires two computers connected together? That's kernel debugging, that's right, okay. Which technique is almost never used? Yeah, that's it, source level debugging. We can't use it because we don't have the source code for malware. All right. What technique displays assembly code but does not allow you to run it? All right, that's disassembly. That just lets you examine it, but it doesn't run. All right. If you get the blue screen of death, what should you do? That's kernel mode debugging. The reason you get the blue screen is because the kernel crashed. If it was a user land process that crashed, it could pop up an error message and keep going. But when the kernel crashes, it cannot continue. That's why you get the blue screen. So you can analyze the crash dump, or you can go back and reproduce it while debugging the kernel and find out what happened. So I've got WITB, who I think we knew who you were last semester, but this semester we have not been able to figure out who you are. So if you want your points, you'll have to tell us who you are. Mhino is a real name. And then I have Greek, who clearly, I'm not going to know who that is unless they tell me. But anyway, those are the winners, such as they are. And, aha, this may be someone's information coming in. I thought you might be. Okay, good. All right, good. So that's identified, good. And WITB word is me. Oh, good. Okay, good. Thank you. Good, I remember your name. Good, good. That's important because I think you won some other thing we didn't know who you are. Good. Well, that helps. All right. So it's only 27 after, so we can do another section of these slides. Let's take a look at that. All right. So to use your debugger, you can start the debugger and then launch your program in the debugger, the way you might start Microsoft Word and then open a Word document inside it, and that's fine. What it will do then is load the program into memory and stop, because it assumes you probably want to look at or modify something, so the program will not actually launch. It will load in the debugger and pause until you hit run in the debugger to start it. The other thing you can do is you can have a program that's already running and you can attach to a running process. That's another way to go. That will again pause it, but this is a way you might want to debug a process that has been altered by malware. You can step through the instructions one by one. Click, 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 like we did in Jasmine. That's slow, of course, but that way you won't miss anything, but it might take thousands of clicks to do things. So that's not too exciting. So here's code that's going to decode a string. So it's going to load some contents of memory in EDI, and then XOR, the thing it points to here. Let me get this thing to a size so I can use my mouse and make it bigger. All right, so here it's going to load EDI, put ECX in here, and then it's going to load from that address, XOR it with a value, and then increment it and XOR it again. So this is going to XOR every byte with the key of 09C. So it will code or encode bytes. So this is that's a decoder. And so you could single step. If you step, you'll see it just gradually feeds in one character at a time, gradually growing the decoded stuff. And this is what you saw if you've been doing the Jasmine projects where we have this thing. It's decoding a string in memory, and this is what people do to avoid being analyzable by strings. So they want to do something like load library, but they don't want you seeing load library in strings, so they put in something scrambled, and they have a descrambler that uses it, and then deletes it or scrambles it again later. So the actual readable strings only appear briefly in memory. And that's why you'd want to run the code partway through and then stop. So there's two general techniques. You can, if you step to the next instruction, there's two choices. One is to just do the next instruction, whatever it is. But what you often want to do is step over, because your userland code is the code written by the developer, which probably contains bugs and interesting things. Then they're going to do something like call a library, like printf or something, and it's going to do hundreds of assembly language instructions down in the kernel, and you probably don't care about that. Unless you're trying to find a 0 day in the kernel and sell it to Zerodium or something, you probably aren't interested in debugging the Microsoft kernel. You probably want to debug the code that the malware author wrote. So you step over, which means don't just do the next instruction, do the whole subroutine until it returns back to this level. Don't go down. Stay at this level. Go to the next instruction at the level I'm in. That's what step over does. You can also do stepping into a call, and that will go into the lower level and stay there, which is what you do if you want to see every instruction. But stepping over is faster, and it keeps you at the level you want to be at. The problem is it might take a long time to do what happens down there. It might even crash down there, and you're not going to see that. So stepping over might pass through instructions you'd like to examine, but it's a good way to get started. And remember, the general process here is you want to take a fast cursory look at something and then go back and take another look at the important points. So taking a skim over it first is probably the thing to do, and then going back to analyze if that doesn't work. You can put breakpoints in the program. This is there, and it will run until it hits this point and stops. This is very useful, of course, if you can do something like find a string or some other clue to tell you what part of it is interesting, and then you don't even have to figure out what happens before that. So here it's going to call something, call EX. It's going to load ECX from someplace in memory. It's going to load EAX from some address I don't know, and then it's going to call that address. So it's going somewhere, but I don't even know where it's going. So what I might do is just put a breakpoint on this call EAX. Then it will run to that point and stop, and I can look and see what EAX is. This is one form of self-modifying code, if you want to look at it that way. It's going to calculate the address, so you can't even just read it in a printout. All right, so here's a program that calculates a file name and then creates a file. This is a common thing. There's a lot of malware that creates a file with a random name. It's different every time, or that connects to a command and control center, and it keeps changing that in a pseudo-random way. So there are things that are created only dynamically. So again, you just put a breakpoint at the function that creates the file and then see what it's about to write. There's a lot of cases where this is why you use debuggers, and that's why debuggers are pretty easy. You don't really have to read all the assembly code or understand it all. You just need to somehow find the point of interest, and you can pause there and examine what's happening. So here's what WinDebug looks like. It is there's a variety of these Microsoft utilities that are actually command line utilities, and for some reason they put it in a window that doesn't work right just to frustrate you. So you can only type in commands down here, and they appear up here, and they have menus and windows just to waste your time that don't work very well. They only did this for a while. I think it dates from the old Windows 3.1 days when Windows were really primitive. But anyways, that's why it's a little clumsy to use, but you can get used to it. It's a lot less graphical and a lot less friendly than Ollie. But of course, it has essentially the same function. So it hits a breakpoint, and now it prints out EAX, EBX, ECX. Here's the stack pointer, the instruction pointer, the base pointer. It has all the same information that you'll see in a graphical debugger like Ollie Debug, but it's presented in a more unfriendly way. And you have to do everything at the command line down here with these little 1 or 2 character mnemonics that you have to memorize. So it's not as much fun as something that actually uses the mouse. Yeah.
Professor Sam, is this still being used in Windows? Or
Oh, yeah.
Is like in server 2008,
Oh, yeah.
12, 16, 19?
Oh, yeah, you have to. It's the only debugger that can debug the kernel, and it's the one everyone uses at Microsoft. So a lot of people say you should just use WinDebug and not use anything else if you're cool. But most people start with Ollie, which is what script kiddies use to cheat on games because it's a lot more friendly. And after you get good at Ollie, then you're ready to sort of tackle this thing, which has removed all the fun parts. But in principle, they both do the same job.
Which one would you?
I use Ollie. I avoid this thing as much as possible.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty much a wimp. This is why I use Nano instead of VI. I do a lot of things the easy way. The elite people have these elite tools they use, and I'm not that elite. So I haven't found any 0 days that are worth a lot of money, though, or anything. I'm not really that hot at this stuff. I only know the basics. There's a whole world of advanced people. There's people selling Android 0 days for $2 million, and I'm not doing that. And those guys have to get really good at this stuff. So I'm only, I only take it from 0 up to sort of like level 3 out of 10. That's as far as I go.
Keep it simple.
Yep, that's where I'm at. Maybe I'll get up there someday, but I highly doubt it. I don't think I'll ever be fine in 0 days. But anyway, so, all right, then you might have encrypted data. Like say you might have data that's going to be used. It's encrypted, and it's going to, so you just find the point where it's decrypted and view it. Read it before it's encrypted, or read it after it's decrypted. This is what you do. Why you do something like use a keylogger to steal a password rather than trying to use the encrypted network traffic. You steal it before it gets encrypted. So here's an example that will view data before the program's encrypted. This place here is going to call encrypt data. This is going to set up some data ready to encrypt. So if you put a breakpoint here, you can examine the data before it calls the encryptor. So same kind of thing. These are simple ways to use a debugger. So your friend is Ollie Debug. Ollie Debug is the easiest debugger, and I'll demonstrate it later. But just in general terms, what this does, over here is the assembly code. It's got move and call and all that jazz. Here are the registers, EAX and EBX and EIP and ESP. Here is the stack, and here is just a place where you can dump data, hexadecimal and ASCII. And so this shows you the state of a program and the state of the processor while the program runs. And it's really pretty easy to use. Like I say, it's been around for a long time, and script kiddies use it to cheat on Windows games, which is what we're going to do. That's the easiest way to learn how to use it. Yeah.
Sorry, you said like Android, well, like 0 days, Google will play upwards to 2 million. Not
Google, unfortunately. Google will only pay you 100 or 200,000, and Apple will. But if you go to Zerodium, Zerodium is like a weapons dealer. Zerodiums will sell it to probably foreign military, and they will pay 10 times as much. They just changed the price. It used to be $1 million for iOS malware. Now it is $2 million for iOS 0 days, and they just raised the price for Android malware, Android 0 days, to $2.25 million. And those are the most dangerous. Those are ones that will give you complete root access with no user interaction from just viewing a web page. Now that is hard to do, but those do exist, and it just came out that about 11 of those just came out. The government of China used about 6 of them to attack the Uyghurs inside China, and some other group had another 5 that just came out. So a bunch of iOS 0 days are out there where all you do is view a page and they take over your machine completely. So you can do it to an iPhone and you can do it to an Android, but nation state actors can, but nobody that has less than about $1 million can get one of those. Those are really valuable.
I want to ask a question, but I'll ask you one breaks here.
Sure, that's fine. Anyway, all right. So there's 2 kinds of breakpoints. There's software and hardware execution, and then there's a conditional. 3 kinds of breakpoints, but software is by far the most common. The software execution breakpoint is really simple. You have the code sitting in memory, and you take what the debugger does is it takes 1 byte of the code and replaces it with CC. CC is the byte that causes code to stop. It triggers an interrupt, and the interrupt is interrupt number 3, and interrupt number 3 is picked up by the debugger, which is typically running Python, and that lets it pause and let you see what's happening. So it takes 1 byte of the real code out and puts it and it places it with CC, so the code will run until it hits the CC, then it will return. That's all it does. It's very simple, and it works very well. This is what most breakpoints are in your code. So if you look at the memory here and you put a breakpoint at this instruction, push EBP is really 55 in hexadecimal. But if you look at the actual memory with another program like HXD, you will find that what's actually there is CC because you put a breakpoint in it. The debugger has stored somewhere else the fact that it should be 55 and it shows you 55 because that's what the developer put there. But what's actually in memory has a CC there. That's why there's a breakpoint. That's what it means when you put a breakpoint there. Number 2?
Where it says memory dump.
Yeah, well, that's right. That's right. Over here, you see the real memory. That's CC right there. Exactly. That CC right there is what's really in memory, but what it should be is a 55. That's what it means when you put a breakpoint. The contents of memory is changed, but the debugger will not show you the instruction changing because you're supposed to understand that's just a temporary breakpoint. When you continue the instruction, it will put the 55 back and continue. So basically, the debugger creates self-modifying code, or it modifies the code for you. It can change the image in memory. And you could do it yourself manually. You could load a program in memory, pause it, then go to a thing like Norton Disk Editor or HXD and change the bytes. That's all it's doing. It's changing the memory image while it runs. All right, now the problem is sometimes software execution breakpoints fail, although this is very rare and I've never had to deal with situations where they fail. Normally they're good enough. However, in principle, suppose you had a code modification utility. I've seen these in Android. There's some Android things that verify the integrity of the code before they run. So it might do something like calculate the MD5 of the code before running. And if you have a breakpoint, the MD5 will be wrong because the actual bytes of memory are different. So that's a case where this kind of breakpoint would cause the program to not operate correctly. So that's an issue. So there is an alternative, and these are hardware execution breakpoints. There are special registers in the processor just for this purpose, where you can put breakpoints at addresses without changing any of the code. The processor itself will remember these 4 addresses, pause when you get there, just for this reason. So you can debug code without modifying it all. But there's only 4 of them. They're in hardware, and you can't get any more. So it's rare that you need these, but they are an option if you have some exotic reason why you must use them.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
That's in the CPU.
In the CPU, yeah.
It was like, is there a limit where you can exploit the CPU or any part of the hardware?
Not often. There's a little bit of exploit in the CPU in Spectre and Meltdown. That came out about a year ago. There are conditions under which regions of memory that you're not allowed to see, you can leak the data out of them by carefully adding instructions around it that cause the interaction with other instructions to leak it out. So that kind of thing happens. But I'm not aware of exploiting these breakpoints. But there are little defects. And the biggest one is Spectre Meltdown. That's scaring everybody. All current hardware has a fundamental flaw due to the pipelining that made it faster. To speed it up, they caused instructions to interact with each other. So some instructions you execute will tell you something about other instructions, what they did that you aren't supposed to see. So under certain conditions, you can see over into memory you're not allowed to see. And that's a fundamental problem with all modern processors. And there have been attempts to patch it, but the attempts are imperfect. So everyone really freaked out about a year ago when this came out. The entire generation of current computers have a defect that causes the security barriers to be somewhat leaky. And right now we just have a series of imperfect patches to hold it together while we wait for another generation of hardware to come out. But of course, that's true of everything. Like there always were 0 days in your iPhone, 0 days in your Android. Everything has holes. And the smartest and most powerful attackers are getting in. I met a guy a few years ago at a coffee house. He was a Russian. He said, "Oh, you're in security. Can you help me? I left Russia, and my friends back in Russia are in the KGB, and they're always irritating me. Every time I read my email, they're popping up chat messages. They're putting pictures on my screen. They're sending messages to my girlfriend. They're mocking me. What can I do?" And I said, "Nothing. You're hosed." And he said, "That's what I thought. They have access to stuff that will just punch through everything you can buy." I said, "If you were to boot off like a CD and run Ubuntu Linux, you'll be fine as long as you never log into anything like email. But as soon as you log in, you're toast." And the same thing's true. If the NSA is after you, what are you going to do? Dig a hole and hide in it? I mean,
Live under a rock.
Yeah, that's the point. I mean, nothing is perfect. There are holes in everything you use. You just try to patch them with things like antivirus so that low-level attackers like criminals trying to steal your credit card number can't get in. But if the military is after you, you're toast. You just have to hopefully not do something so bad that somebody really powerful will come after you. So does Ollie work to a certain extent? Ollie works fine. There's no KGB. That's true. It's not the KGB. It's the GRU or something now. Good point. We will use a little bit of GIDRA. Yes, later in the semester, we'll use some GIDRA in this class and the exploit development class, I think. I've got one GIDRA project, and I'm hoping to add a few more. Good. Anyway, so, all right. So you can, in principle, running code can change these, and there's an attempt in the hardware to detect if somebody is modifying those registers to change your hardware execution breakpoints, but it's not perfect. It only detects some instructions. But anyway, these things are not that commonly used. But in principle, they're not that reliable either. Someone could, in fact, mess with your use of hardware execution breakpoints. Then there's conditional breakpoints. These are actually implemented in software. Instead of just putting a CC at the instruction, it could put a CC at the instruction, and every time it gets hit, it could then calculate a logical condition and decide whether to really stop or not. So you could have a more complicated condition, like break every time you call get proc address, but then only really break if the parameter being passed in has a certain value. So what this will mean is the debugger will break every time, but it'll automatically restart if the condition is not true. So you can hunt for some exotic condition. Of course, this will slow down your program greatly because every time you break, you move from assembly code, which is the fastest, out to the debugger, which is probably interpreted Python 1,000 times slower. So it's going to slow down execution, but it is a way to hunt for an exotic condition, which you might want in certain conditions. And of course, that's why conditional breakpoints take much longer, because you have to run, every time you break, you have to run some code inside the debugger to decide whether to resume or not. So your program's actually pausing and resuming many times. All right. So I got a few Cahoots about that. And let's get rid of these. And we're looking for 8B. Okay. All right. Yeah, I guess the Bahamas are in pretty bad shape.
So there's 8 people watching this.
Yeah. Oh, I think 11, something like that. Yeah, 11 people online. All right. I'll wait a few more seconds. I think we might have got up to 11 last time.
I think so, yeah. It's your call, sir.
What's that?
It's your call if you want to start.
It's my call.
Yeah, if you want to start. There we go, 11 people.
Oh, good. Okay, fair enough. All right, let's carry on. All right, so what kind of breakpoint uses interrupt number 3? All right, that's a software execution breakpoint, the most common kind. So what kind of breakpoint might slow down your program? Your conditional breakpoint has to make a decision in slow Python. All right. What's the most common breakpoint? Okay, software execution. All right. Which one might cause you to miss important functionality? Stepping over means you jump into a subroutine and all the sub-subroutines and come back and you don't really see what happens while that's in there. All right, so that's Caitlin, and good, I don't know who they are. In fact, it's the same people again, all right? That makes life simple. All right. And I think, all right, it's about 12 minutes to the hour. I think we'll just finish this, then we'll take a break, and I'll demonstrate some of this Ollie debug stuff, the project where you hack some stuff with Ollie debug, and good thing to see. So let's talk about exceptions. If you have a program, it executes instructions and runs, exceptions are basically errors. Something happened which is going to interrupt the orderly progress of your code, where the operating system is going to do something other than what the developer expected it to do. For example, dividing by 0, it can't do that. Attempting to read memory outside the bounds of memory reserved for your program, things like that can happen, where something happens, which means it has to stop executing the code it was running and jump off and do something else. So breakpoints generated and other conditions do. There are two kinds of exception. When an exception occurs, if you're debugging code, the first thing it does is hand over the control to the debugger, because the debugger might want to handle it. That's the first chance. If the debugger can then handle the exception, or it can pass it back to the program, now the program has an opportunity to handle it with exception handlers. And we'll see these in exploit development class. You'll hear we're only going to talk about them, we're not going to do them. There's a thing called the structured exception handler in Windows. You can define exception handlers in your program. Now, if you don't, the exception will pass to the operating system, and it will pop up a box saying, this program has crashed, what would you like to do? The one you saw on an earlier slide. That's, if you're a sloppy coder, then the operating system itself handles your errors. It would be more professional to write your own error handler so that even when your code crashes, it doesn't stop running. Some internal process handles it, says, this program has a bug, please click here to tell the developer about it or something. So that's, you can write your own exception handler, and that'll happen if the debugger doesn't want it. You can pass it back to the program will try to handle it. If the program's exception handler cannot handle it, then it will pass to the operating system, which will then pop up whatever its message is. If it's user land, it'll be that box that says this program has crashed, would you like to debug it or something. If it's in the kernel, you'll get the blue screen of death. That's what happens when you have an exception in the kernel, because the program cannot keep running and the operating system cannot keep running either when you have a problem in the kernel. So that's the game. Then it goes to second chance to the program. The debugger gets a second chance to catch it. And so that's the game. All right. So int3 is the most common one, of course. That's a breakpoint we put in there just so it will stop. If you do single steps in the debugger, you can do step, step, step. It does that by just putting breakpoint on every step. Step and break, step and break, step and break, step and break. That's what it does. Okay. There's also a trap flag in the registers that will automatically cause it to do this right by itself. You don't even need a debugger. It will automatically stop after every instruction. And there's a memory access violation I mentioned before. This is because you attempt to access memory that is outside the range allocated to your process, or you attempt to do something in memory that you're not allowed to do, like write to read-only memory or execute non-executable memory. Those are all memory access violations, and they will cause exceptions. This is what you look for when you're trying to find bugs. You fuzz programs like setting in random data, long input in all the fields, and you look for memory violation exceptions, because what you're hoping is that some of the data you put in went into a register like EIP and caused it to have an invalid value. So memory access violation exceptions are commonly what leads to exploitable vulnerabilities, although most of them are not exploitable because you just go off the end of something and there's no easy way to control that. You can violate privilege rules, like I say. You could attempt to execute a kernel command from user mode. That's a violation of privilege. The same thing here. All right. So here's a chart of exceptions. Here's divide by 0. 1 is a debug exception. 2 is a non-maskable interrupt. 3 is a breakpoint. And there's just a whole series of these online. You can get the codes for all the types of exceptions if you want to get down to that level. Normally, we don't really care. And the only one we use much is interrupt 3, and you use it through breakpoints. You don't even really need to know it's an interrupt 3, but that's what it is. All right. So you can modify execution with a debugger. You can pause at a breakpoint, and you can examine memory and then just continue, but you could also pause and you could change things. You can change the value of the registers, change the EIP and go to a different instruction. You can even take some of the instructions and change them before you continue, like replace them with NOPs to skip code and such. That's the reason why people love debuggers. So you could load a game, observe that you start with like 10 missiles, then search for 10 and go back and change that to 100. And then run the game, and now you'd have 100 missiles. That's why I say cheating at games is a common use of debuggers. Yeah.
I'm sorry, can you Can you clarify the violations?
Well, the violations are when the processor has encountered something illegal and it cannot execute the current instruction. Then it triggers an exception, which goes out to throw up some kind of error message.
Oh,
That's what's going on. When you've told it what to do, but when it somehow cannot do what you told it to do, it sends off an exception informing you.
thank you.
Yeah, that's important. Okay. So, all right. So you could test a function directly. You could even run a program direct. You could even run a function without calling it from the main program. You could just start at the address of the function and feed in the parameters in the registers. If you wanted to, you could run a function all alone. Of course, when it returns from that function, it won't be able to resume because you haven't set the other values around it, but you could test one function in isolation if you wanted to. I never had to do this, but you certainly can do it. So in practice, here's one. Quite a few viruses are like this. A lot of viruses are either written by nation state actors, so they target only certain states, like the 0 days that I mentioned earlier that just came out about iOS. We're targeting Chinese Muslim minorities from the Chinese government, so they did not want to affect anyone outside China. Now, you might think they're doing this out of politeness, but it's not politeness. They don't want to get caught by American antivirus companies. So they don't want to run the virus in America. So they put it on the page, and the first thing it does is it gains code execution on your machine, but what it does is it interrogates your machine to see what language you're using. And only if you're using Chinese does it bother to do more to you. And then it does further attempts. This is an important part of almost all professional malware is to target someone. Stuxnet, for example. Stuxnet would go on USB sticks and it would infect every XP machine it came to, and it would spread to all the other USB sticks, but the only thing it would do was interrogate that machine and say, does this machine have software installed on it which controls a particular brand of Siemens logic controllers that are used in the isotope separators in Iran? And if that's not what was in there, it would not do any harm. It would just spread to the next one. It would wait until it found its target and then attack it. And the idea is to prevent other people from noticing. And that failed, and that's why we know about Stuxnet. There are probably many successful cyber war campaigns that wiped out all traces and never got caught by antivirus companies or anybody else, so we never knew about it. Yeah. It was really pretty small. It was about 3 files on a USB stick. They were not very big at all. They used a 0 day to take over XP machines, and then it would infect all the further USB sticks that went in. But they wouldn't do any harm to the XP machine unless it had a Siemens controller installed, and then it would attack the actual centrifuge. It was really quite sophisticated. Anyway, and so there's malware here that would read your language, and if you're in Chinese, it will do nothing. If you're in English, it will just pop up an annoying box, but if you're in Japanese or Indonesian, then it will destroy the whole hard drive. This is fairly common. Now, this might be because the nation state is doing another reason this happens, for example, in Russia. Putin very much likes his hackers, and he regards it as perfectly fine. You can put up an ad in Russia that says, I will hack any website you want, any bank, pay me $300, I will write the code, mail it to you, and you just have to click on this button, it will click in. And they run businesses like that, and Putin thinks that's fine, but he won't let you do it to targets in Russia. So if you want to stay in business, you have to write stuff that will not attack anybody in Russia. So this is quite common that you look at the IP address or the language or something to keep track of who you're hurting, because for various reasons, it's often bad business to hurt one country. And of course, a lot of them are patriotic hacktivists where they want to, like they're Chinese patriots, and they want to punish America for saying something bad about China. So again, they would only want to hurt Americans. So this is the thing you'll see. Yeah.
What happened to Anonymous?
Yeah, Anonymous, the FBI crushed Anonymous. They turned a bunch of Sabu primarily. They turned several insiders, and they betrayed all the rest and scared them all back into their hole. So they pretty much vanished. There's still a few small anonymous groups doing this and that, but the whole thing is pretty much gone because the FBI jailed enough of them to scare the rest back into their hole. And then it went sort of out of fashion. Yeah, it's a good point. They were doing everything for a while, but that's what law enforcement does, you know, scare them back in their hole when you catch enough of them. So here's the assembly language that does that. It calls get system default LCID, which is something like localization identification, and it gets a number. So it's going to find this return value. EAX goes into this variable, and here's the numbers. 409 is English, 411 is Japanese, 421 is Indonesian, and CO4 is Chinese. So it then jumps to different routines depending on what it finds there. All right, so one more set of Cahoots, and then we'll take a break, and I'll demonstrate some of this Ollie stuff. Let's get rid of this. And this is by now 8C. And it is here. No.
Gotta answer.
Yep.
It's gonna be Caitlin.
Yeah, probably. I know Staccato 3301 is good, clean fun. That's an online puzzle that everyone solved for a while. It seems to be gone now, but anyway. I'll wait a few seconds to see if we're going to have 11. All right, apparently we've suffered one casualty. On we go. All right, so which one handles exceptions during normal program execution? Yeah, the structured exception handler is written by the developer to handle exceptions. All right. What kind of exception doesn't stop code execution and can usually be ignored? That's the first chance exception. All right. If a ring 3 process tries to access hardware directionally, what happens? That's privilege violation, like trying to execute an administrator command without administrator rights. All right. So I bet no is probably Caitlin. It looks like Caitlin to me. Yes, I don't know though.
Me.
Yes, it's you. Okay, good.
I finally got on the board.
Good. All right. And Rich, that's a real name. All right. And you're Abdul. Good. I was trying to remember. All right. So that's good.
Okay.
I got you. And is that other one really Caitlin? Perhaps this will be telling me. Yep. That's what I thought. She's no. All right. So Caitlin is here. All right. So I have recorded these scores. All right. So I'm going to stop this recording. And at 7:10, I'll do a demonstration of these Ollie debug projects. I'll leave the share going, but I'll stop the recording.